get going with the last panel here. I wanted to report that the food waste, at least from your plate, what you didn't finish, what we didn't finish today, this is including what might have been cut off while they were preparing things, or what didn't get eaten and how they deal with that. But what we didn't eat from our plate amounted to about 6 quarts compressed of food. It's still on the porch. I should probably have gotten a lid for it, but it's still out there if you want to go look at it. And that actually, all of the food scraps from Vermont Law School get collected and taken to Hurricane Flats, which is just a mile down the road, and Geo Honeyford, the farmer there, composts them and makes use of them on his farm. So we're going to be hearing more about composting from this panel. I'm going to introduce the moderator. This is Jaime Renner. He's the director of the clinic at the Center for Ag and Food Systems here at Vermont Law. The clinic opened this fall. Jaime has his BA from Middlebury and his JD from American University in Washington, D.C. He's a recipient of, among other accolades, 2 Equal Justice Foundation fellowships. He worked as a litigation associate at a firm in New York for 4 years before coming here. He was also a AmeriCorps volunteer at one point, and he was a law clerk for the Honorable Phyllis D. Thompson in the D.C. Court of Appeals. So Jaime's going to lead the panel here on agricultural and food waste.
Thank you, Jack. Thank you. Thanks for a great day. I just want to note that you've all survived. This is the last panel. It's a fantastic panel. So far today, we've addressed energy waste and ocean waste and electronic waste. And now we're going to turn our focus to waste in the world of food and agriculture. Before I introduce our first panelists, I just wanted to provide a note of context. According to the National Resources Defense Council, getting food to our tables in America eats up 10% of our total energy budget, 50% of our land, and 80% of the fresh water that we consume each year. And despite this, 40% of our food goes wasted. That's more than 20 pounds of food per person each month. And that means we're throwing away the equivalent of $165 billion each year, a significant percent of our fresh water, huge amounts of chemicals, energy, and land, as well as potential nutrition for people, animals, and soil. Moreover, almost all of this uneaten food ends up rotting in landfills, where organic matter accounts for 16% of our methane emissions. And according to the EPA, only 5% of our unused food is diverted to composting. And then there's agriculture waste, another universe of processes and byproducts underlying land, fresh water, and energy, potential nutrition, potential compost, and potential toxic pollutants if not managed or repurposed properly. So the first panelist is Jean Bonhotal. Jean is the director of the Cornell Waste Management Institute. She's worked in solid waste education for over 20 years. She works on composting feedstock, manure, bedding, and animal carcasses, among other things. She previously worked with the U.S. Forest and National Park Service, the EPA, the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, and the landscape and greenhouse industry. She has a Master of Science in Education and Communication, a Bachelor of Science in Biology, and an Associate's in Applied Sciences and Natural Resources. So I'd like to welcome Jean, the first panelist.
Organics. There are just endless organics out there. And when we talk about organics today, in my definition of organics, it's not that strict definition. It's something that was once alive and is now dead and needs to be managed. When we look at our whole waste stream, organics are over 60% of our waste stream. And when we have these numbers up here, they don't include things like biosolids. We never take those things into account. And biosolids are manure, we call it. So there's large amounts of paper. Paper should be recycled if it can. When it's soiled, it can be composted. There's large amounts of food waste. And everybody can put these numbers up here, and over the years, 4 or 5 of us will get up with these pie charts, and they all end up being right about in the same place. So things haven't changed a whole lot with these breakdowns. Then there are some other materials, but about 60% of our whole waste stream, at least, could be composted or could be managed in another way. We've amended, EPA has a waste management hierarchy, a pyramid of how things should be disposed of. And we sort of amended that and expanded it a little bit. But reduction is so important. Reuse is really important. Do we feed animals with it? Can we feed people with it? I was just in Kenya, and I ate dinner after a long day of working. I was working on soil organic matter there. And I ate dinner, but they gave us so much dinner that we couldn't eat all of our dinner. And after dinner, they said, do you want to take it? And I said, well, I can't. I'm traveling and I don't have refrigeration or anything. And so they gave it to someone else. And I was thrilled. The security people don't have that much food, so they give it to the security people. And then we sort of caught on to that and said, okay, I'll just eat what I need and pass it on to somebody else. Really important. So can we feed people? Can we feed animals with some of these feedstocks? Can they be recycled? Can they be composted? Can they be digested? Or do we need to put them in a landfill? Now there's a lot of controversy over putting food waste in landfills and organics in landfills. Some of us feel that it should be out of the landfills, and some people that are capturing gas from the landfills feel that it should be in there. So there's a lot of controversy. All in all, that methane that they're getting out of it can only be mined for a few years. It doesn't last that long. Once we cap that landfill, a lot of it's already escaped into the atmosphere and we really aren't recovering it. So I'm more for managing our organics. So just another one, source reduction, feed hungry people, feed animals, industrial uses. We may use it before we compost it. Lots of different feedstocks. Sorry, that color's not working very well. Food waste, food processing wastes, manures, weeds, garden residuals, leaves, biosolids, animal parts. There's an endless list of those. I usually have a couple of pages, but I didn't want to go too far with that. On a policy note, we would like to, and EPA and a lot of our state agencies are really pushing towards capturing food waste. I'm going to talk about several different feedstock, but they're very much pushing toward composting food waste or digesting it or getting some more energy out of food waste. And that's important. We may be able to do it on a large scale, but we really don't even have the infrastructure to do it all on a large scale. We don't have the compost facilities in place to even be able to take all this material. One of the things that we really push is that people do it on their own. They do it at their home. They do it in small bins. And also schools, institutions, we encourage them to be composting their leaf and yard waste, their food scraps, all of those materials really can be handled on site. And if we handle those on site, then we have no responsibility for moving them around. No labor, no fuel, and the homeowner ends up with a product. So, a compost product. So it's important, and so we're really pushing this as much as anything. We will always have large compost facilities, but we're trying to push people to be responsible and create their own compost. Separation of food waste, very, very hard to do. One of the problems with food waste, it's one of the ones we're just adding now. And the reason that we're just adding it now is because it's so hard to collect. It's putrescible, it breaks down quickly, and there's a lot of garbage in it. We tend to, Karl will talk next, he tends to be able to keep most of the waste out of it, but it really is a problem. So this happens to be just an example of how are we separating these, source separating these materials so that we can manage them. This is another kind of controversial one. We could get a garbage disposal, a Hobart, whatever product. We could get those, we could grind it all, just put it right down the sink, right? Good solution? Probably not. Our wastewater treatment plants can't handle that. So if it's going to a centralized wastewater treatment plant, we just couldn't even handle that capacity. We would be way over capacity if we did that. And we would take that high value food and degrade it to a biosolid. So all of it would be human waste, considered human waste at that point. And we would have very specific ways that that could be used and processed. So, but lots and lots of food out there. Leaf and yard waste. Many of us, many of our communities across the country compost leaf and yard waste. That was one of the earlier ones. We decided that we weren't going to fill landfills with leaves because it just takes up a lot of room, and landfills cost about $1 million an acre or more to build. That's expensive landscape. So we took a lot of the leaf and yard waste out of the landfills, and that was, in some ways it's regulated, in some places it's not regulated. It really varies from state to state whether there are regulations saying that that has to happen. But we have a lot of leaf and yard waste composting facilities, and they would greatly benefit from having food additions because leaves are very highly carbonaceous and they need that nitrogen, so they really need each other, and it could be done. So we do have more capacity than it looks like, especially if some of the municipalities can expand. Sometimes the law says you can only take in leaf and yard waste, and we have situations where that is the case in some states, and they actually add fertilizer for their nitrogen, which is kind of ridiculous. But it breaks those leaves down and it makes it all work. So sometimes that's done, but that's something where regulation has pushed maybe in the wrong direction. Manures. A lot of manure is used right on the farms. I mean, most of the time we're using manure on farms. Sometimes it's composted, sometimes it's digested, and digestion is pretty much opposite of composting. Digestion, we're using anaerobic organisms, and composting, we're using aerobic organisms. So really different processes. A digester produces energy, generates energy, and that energy can be used on the farms. They're extremely expensive to run and build and all that kind of stuff, so it's hard. I think there are 2 in Vermont. We have 1 or 2. What's that?
17.
You have 17 manure digesters now? Oh, good deal. You're catching up to us. We have about 22, 23 in New York. I didn't realize that there were that many here. But they're very expensive, and we're actually in New York, we're actually the regulators are actually even paying them to maintain those digesters. They're that expensive. So it's a very expensive option compared to composting, which tends not to be. It can be done in a low-tech manner and produce product. So lots of manure is composted throughout the United States. Most of us can also spread dairy manure on cropland. We're allowed to do that. It's under the rules, and that's still the case. In Vermont, they have more strict rules about applying any manure to snow, on top of snow. So, but a lot of states you can pretty much just move it around. A lot of times it runs off. So one of the advantages of a farmer composting that manure is that it's going to stay on the farm. And it's going to be, the nutrients are going to be able to be used right on those soils. Other feedstocks. And I'm just running through a lot of different feedstocks. About half of my work is composting mortality. And for the ocean people, we do whales too. We basically developed a method because there's a lot of need to compost dead animals. Our rendering industry, who used to take all of the meat waste, really, like our economy, the bubble burst. And we just don't have the means to be able to find markets for all of those meat products. At one point, we were feeding cows to cows. And that's why we were able to have such a huge market share for rendering. And now we are not allowed to do that. And there are some other tighter restrictions that keep us from doing that. So we compost them. We envelop them in carbon. And they disappear. A 1,200-pound cow will disappear in 3 months. You'll find some nice clean bones there. We also do roadkill. And these are pictures of roadkill. In New York, we do it pretty extensively. In Vermont, I don't know if there's very much of it going on. We have taught it here. We've taught mortality, butcher waste, and so we also do butcher waste. And some of the butchers here in Vermont also are composting their butcher waste because if they don't have access to a renderer. What are the laws? Basically, this is a map, a GIS map, that we have on our website, and it tells you what the laws are for all the different states of how we dispose of dead stuff, whether it's mortality or butcher waste or whatever. Biosolids. What are the rules for biosolids? EPA has rules, so that's one of our most highly regulated types of compost. And we have to do that properly. Most of it's done indoors. We do have some small facilities that compost their biosolids, and they do it in a lower tech method, but most of it's done in a pretty high tech method. And we have to deal with, in those composts, we have to deal with inerts and chemical contaminants, viruses, drugs. So there are use limitations in those because they do have to test them, but you're testing a whole batch, so you don't know what's in that. So there are use recommendations for biosolids. I just want to show you a few creative ways that they've used some of the biosolids. This is in Texas, and I saw some bare hills here in Vermont yesterday when I was driving in, so I thought I'd throw this out there. They're actually using a biosolids compost, but any quality, all qualities of compost could be used. They spray it on the slope, and this is Texas where things shouldn't be able to grow, but their aquifers were in such bad shape in Texas that they had to start putting vegetation on their roadsides. This is 8 months later. One other one, and these are just some of the compost uses. Again, they were really in trouble. They put compost down, and they were able to hydroseed those roadsides down, and they have a much healthier aquifer now. We were talking about energy a little bit earlier. This is a composting heat transfer facility. So what they're doing is they put the manure, this is just a bank of manure, so back to a farm. They put that bank of manure in there. The bank of manure heats up to 120 to 150, 60 degrees. And they're able to heat hot water with that and convert that into energy and use that energy. And Karl has a small mobile unit. I went to his farm yesterday. They have a small mobile unit that they're trying out there to heat his greenhouse. Digesters. We also are using digesters, as I said. Vermont's got 17, I just heard. So, and they come in all shapes, sizes, forms, and they produce digested solids. But those digested solids need to be managed further. So we take all the solids off, and we need to compost those if we want to export that material. If they want to use it directly on their farms, they can put it right on their farms and use that there. Just one last one. These are the compost facilities. We have GIS maps for a couple different things, not just mortality waste and butcher waste, but we also have them for compost facilities, and we have over 300 compost facilities in New York State. I am jealous of some of the other states because New York State has not put any legislation in place to compost food waste. New York City has. And they're starting things off, but New York State hasn't really pushed that, where Vermont and Connecticut and Massachusetts have, put some teeth into their laws, and they're working toward getting all their food scrap and their organics out of the waste stream and to a proper place to use the organic matter. People often will ask, what if we produce too much compost? I don't think there's a possibility that that can ever happen. We need that organic matter in our soils. Our soils are in desperate shape, and in many cases, because we use a lot of chemical fertilizer and don't feed them, and compost really is the answer to rectifying that situation. Okay?
Thank you. And also, like with the last panel, we'll have questions at the end. And while we queue up the next presentation, our next presenter is Karl Hammer. Karl is the owner of Vermont Compost Company. He grew up working on farms in Berkshire, Vermont, and also spent some time farming in Spain. He began making compost in 1993. He founded the Vermont Compost Company to address the need for consistent, high-quality compost and compost-based living soil mixes for certified organic plant production. The Vermont Compost Company supplies growers in the Northeast, but also reaches farms in Illinois, Iowa, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. Thanks, Karl.
So how do I run my slides? All right. And I'm going to add a little correction here. I actually, before I founded the Vermont Compost Company, I had, I think, the first food waste composting permit in New York State. Worked with the DEC to develop it in a business that's ongoing there now in Eastern New York. So Vermont Compost Company is my second composting business. And when we founded the Vermont Compost Company, my notion was that it would be better to have a decentralized plan in a rural state, that the equipment would be, the material would weigh more than the equipment needed to process it, and we should try to have small facilities and move relevant equipment to those facilities. And with some success we did, actually. I think I've now had 12 sites permitted in Vermont at various moments. But as we started to look at, and we started, Vermont Compost Company started making compost in Vermont. Ben and Jerry's had hired us to help address the waste ice cream problem. And I don't know if people knew that there was a waste ice cream problem. The manufacture of ice cream generates a lot of very high strength dairy waste, which if you make a mistake with it, spill it in a brook or something, the fish are floating quickly. It's got very high biological oxygen demand. And frankly, a few years of composting ice cream, I don't eat ice cream anymore. So I started working with Ben and Jerry's to try to find a solution to they were sending at terrific expense their high strength dairy waste off to wastewater treatment in New York State. It was costing an enormous amount of money. And we developed a process starting out in the Intervale. We partnered with the Intervale Foundation. I was also working with Will Rapid hired me to get their compost process off the ground, and we kind of put those together. We started getting leaves and adding ice cream and some horse manure to leaves, and developed a strategy to do that. And I then incorporated the Vermont Compost Company in '93 in Washington County to continue that work. And after a couple of years, we got very interested in, we got approached by a few motivated generators, the Horn of the Moon Cafe, the Hunger Mountain in our neighborhood, and said, we were throwing away all this food, we'd like a place to take it. And we had a small flock of chickens at the time, and we started to wonder whether we could, just how much of the feed that those egg layers ate could be, the grain that they were eating could be replaced with food rescued. We don't use waste. Waste is a verb, not a noun, so food waste is a thing you do. And then once we get our hands on it, we don't waste it anymore. And in '98, actually we got a small DEC grant to buy a couple hundred chickens, expand our flock from 25 chickens that we were feeding exclusively on the Horn of the Moon's waste, and get a couple hundred birds and see if we could turn that food into eggs on the first day. And here we've been selling eggs since 1998. We haven't bought any grain in that time. And every day since 1998, eggs have been produced and sold on the farm. So I don't know how well you can see that this is our chick rearing facility. And you note the dogs are in there protecting the birds, and in this case we're trying to, the poultry industry is all nowadays one age, so it's all babies together. They've never met an adult, and in this case we're trying to teach them how to utilize food, and they have adults to show them these things. And the dogs are very important in protecting the birds from predators. We're kind of a destination for every kind of canine predator there is. Foxes, coyotes, neighborhood dogs, and so we kind of try to occupy the top of the canine niche with very focused, well-fed, large guard dogs. And here are young birds learning how to get their living on food. And initially we thought feeding baby birds was going to be a challenge because they have very high nutrient density demand. But we can bring in mail order chicks and not feed them grain past the second or third day of their arrival on the farm. We started, the water is very important in this kind of system because all the biota that exist in these materials require water. I'm sorry, this slideshow is really focused on the chicken part of this. Yeah, that old rooster, kind of a friendly guy. And here I'm working a material that we call cake, where we kind of throw some oat seed in and it germinates, and it's not that we never use any grain. I occasionally do use some seed, but something about the germinating oat seed brings the red wigglers out. So that's one of the ways that we get conversion of the energy in the food to high density nutrients that baby birds can use. This is our Layin roost house. Very simple design, double wall full of sawdust. You can see looking out the door there, we don't actually feed birds inside. We manage a hay pack, and then they have to go outside and forage every day for their living. So they work. These are all working birds. This is how we used to get food waste. It came in totes. We tip it into a place with bulking material. Yeah, snow. Well, it snows in Vermont sometimes. Now, you can see there that the heat of the pile actually melts the snow. So summertime's fun, everybody can go eat bugs in the pasture and so on, but wintertime gets a lot more focused, and the heat of the process is necessary so that the birds have the opportunity to forage. And we're able in Vermont to melt the snow, and the birds have warm feet and they can forage without shelter. We're on Main Street in the capital city, in Montpelier, and you can see there's a lot of heat returning there. The birds are involved. The birds learn how to work with the machines. And this is a number of years ago. And then there were crows. All right, crows are people too, at least that's how I feel about it. And actually, Cornell has a great corvid website. Well, if crows and ravens really put you uptight, you should maybe study on them a little bit and just get into how amazing they are as animals. But, and there's corvids generally are evolving quite a bit. Crows, one of the main predators of crows are horned owls, and crows don't see very well at night, and owls see really well at night. So crows actually like to go to places like car dealerships and hospital parking lots, because it's a lot safer at night if you're a crow to be in a lit place. And crows are developing an urbanizing trend. The phenomenon is called pre-roosting, where they aggregate in urban areas where there's light and food, and they can hang out and meet each other, and it's called pre-roosting because they meet and then they pair off and then they go into roosting. But when they're pre-roosting, there can be a lot of them, and they aggregate in urban areas, and sometimes that bothers people. In our case, the crows discovered that around the valley from all the car dealerships and the hospital was this great place where they serve lunch all the time. I never minded because crows are aviators and so when they pick up a mussel and they take off, they unload everything extra, and we're multi-manurialists, and so that contribution was welcome, and as far as we were concerned, they were welcome to the mussel if they want to go eat it somewhere and take it out in a pasture and eat the mussel and leave the shell. And I thought that was kind of poetry, the ocean coming up on the hill before the mussel shell. I have a neighbor who didn't think that was good poetry. And she thought that her landowning rights were violated by a crow coming and eating a lemon or a mussel or landing. And of course, she disliked this so much that she would actually let her dogs out, sick her dogs on the crows. Now, the crow actually lugged that mussel shell up there so that, for privacy, get away from the hubbub with all the other crows and the chickens and the dogs, go sit somewhere quiet and eat whatever the crow took, because the crow's actually working here. So it takes a lot of energy to be a crow, or a bird generally, flying, and they run high temperature, and it's winter, and they don't go south. So generally, they want to eat what they got. But if you sick your dogs on them and go grab it with tongs and put it in a baggie to collect it to show the authorities that this horrible thing is happening, then of course, so one of the things that was interesting as this neighbor started to bring these baggies of collected food to show everybody was the collection rates she was getting. Because I was out trying to collect, food too, and we have places where crows would roost, and I'd go out and gather whatever I could, but she was getting fantastic yields, much higher than I could get. Of course, I wasn't sicking the dogs on the crows. And anyway, the city council of our city undertook to convene itself as a health body, which was dubious law, but can't fight City Hall. And they said, well, we're going to have to shut your farm down because this is a health hazard. The occasional dropping of a mussel shell or a lemon peel on this frozen horse pasture threatens the community's health. And the science there was a little shaky, but I will accept that hysteria is definitely a public health hazard. And so we were able to say, all right, well, we need to mitigate this problem. So I said, well, all right, we'll build structures to exclude. The agreement we ended up making was that we would prevent wild birds from having access to fresh, recognizable food. Well, that sounds easy maybe, but so in February I built the first on the left there of these hoop houses with a curtain of mesh and anything a chicken can get through. Chickens are bigger than crows, so you had to get the chickens in and out, but I've only got 3. All right. So we built these structures. And that's our current kind of strategy is and actually the chickens like it. And over time, of course, the crow pressure, which is very cyclical, like some years you have a lot of crows, some years you don't have any crows. About 15 years ago, we had an enormous influx of seagulls, which hasn't happened since. So this is currently how we feed the birds. And in order to manage the material in those tunnels, I not only had to build the tunnels, but I had to buy a little 3.5-ton excavator to work in the tunnel. So what we were doing with our 16 metric ton excavator that was working really well, and the birds were fine, and the eggs were getting laid, and we were making great compost. Now we built a couple structures, and we had to buy a dedicated $37,000 machine and do it much more slowly with a man who's getting paid the same amount. So overall, our costs went up a lot. And this is just a little bit about regulation and cost. So that's currently how we do it. I should say that little excavator is running completely recycled friolator oil, and it has canola hydraulics and food grease in its moving joints. So we kind of try to mitigate the toxic potential presented by the machines that manage the process. So we use the devil's tools, but we gentled them. It's just showing the kind of temperature you can have on a cold winter day on a pile of compost, 140 degrees. And this is a way we receive food waste. The truck that we're using to gather food waste now, that's the truck, doesn't like to dump on the flat. It's a roll-off truck. It's a lot of compromise with the rendering body. It actually has the capability to wash totes, hot water on the truck. And so we made a pit for it to dump in so it didn't get dirty, because the driver didn't like it getting splashed. And we use that excavator to blend the material. And now you can see we're taking the material out of that pit and piling it up where chickens can get it. And every day that blend of manure and hay, and because we never use more than about 15 to 20% of the rescued food as the regime. Otherwise it freezes, it gets all over the chicken feed, it's dirty, it's unsalubrious. It needs to be blended. And our resource for blending are things like hardwood bark, spoiled hay, fresh hay that we bed with, cow manure, horse manure are the basic ingredients. And we spoon that out of that pit, and then we feed it daily into these tunnels. Well, now we've a little bit broached our agreement, because actually that's not in an enclosure. But so far the city seems to be calm, and there doesn't seem to be a problem. We occasionally do actually provide some opportunity for crows. And I have to say that when this was all going on, and I was a little outraged that my manurial rights were being violated, that here was this opportunity to collect crow manure, and we're not reductionists. We don't think it's how much of anything you have. We know that each type of animal imparts a different biological community into the process, and we're really looking for broad diversities. And Sainer had said, look, let's not talk about your manurial rights, people. Manurial rights are an abstract, kind of complex concept anymore in America. Because I thought it was important. But this is Montpelier. We grow some vegetables. That's garlic. A little bit about predators. We really have them, lots of them, coyotes. First line of predator defense, we had to learn the hard way. When you stop feeding grain to birds, you can do things like have roosters around who would be eating. If you're buying, like most egg producers, very focused on the very narrow margin between the cost of the feed they buy and the value of the egg. And there's no room for anything like an extra doing nothing but weasels. The first line of defense about weasels, rats, etc. are roosters, well-organized roosters. And when fox comes, fox doesn't climb and get the highest, I want that bird up there. Fox takes the first bird and leaves before the dogs get there. And in our place, the first bird is always a rooster, or a group of organized roosters. So we lose roosters, we don't lose hens, and that works in our system, and that's how chickens laid it out anyway. That's why we don't have bears right there. Bears don't come around. Foxes do, but they need to keep moving. It's not a safe thing to be a fox around these guys. That's our other kind of, mostly suburban dogs that might not be smart enough to know they shouldn't be around our dogs, don't necessarily get through the donkey mule perimeter. I even had someone who had come into our pasture, call me up very angry. My donkeys had chased their dog. I said, oh, how did were donkeys out? No, we were in your pasture because actually we were going to bring apples to the donkeys. And the donkeys chased our dog, and you got to do something. I said, well, yeah, it's not, I mean, maybe you should do something, which is like, first of all, be in somebody else's pasture feeding their donkeys without permission. It's dangerous. But, and yeah, you shouldn't bring your dog in our pasture. We're a chicken farm, and we don't invite the dogs in the neighborhood. So. Oops, that's my jackass. He is, my bookkeeper liked this because he's an asset on our books. And he's therefore a fixed asset. But he's not, he's an intact asset. Because we bought him for breeding. We make potting soils for growers, and we also have hosted several growers to grow vegetables on the farm, and this is our making of soil blocks, and Rose down there helping. But we built a greenhouse in about 2000 because we understood that if we were going to provide growers with potting soils, we had to be able to do trials and not release products that wouldn't work. Our whole business model is based on providing performance to professionals, and it's got to work or they don't make any money and they can't pay us. So this is our trials house because we also like to eat things on the farm. You know, sometimes somebody said, well, aren't the chickens a hassle? I mean, and yeah, well, they work. It's a chicken farm, but you know, we like eggs because you can eat them, and we have the idea that food will get you through times of no money better than money will get you through times of no food. The question came up as an Act 250 issue, another regulatory battle that we were engaged in about whether what we do is farming under Vermont law, and especially pertaining to Act 250. And an attorney for the Natural Resources Board, anybody know any attorneys? Well, anyway, he said at a certain point, he said, come on. He said, the eggs are a scam. The chickens are a ruse. The true goal is unregulated compost making. I said, wow, all right, I like this very much because it enabled me thereafter to enjoy a brunch of scrambled eggs, which are those which roosters lay. But ruse is a term of art in our law. It says in Act 250, if the ag exemption, if the agricultural activity is a ruse to avoid regulation, the exemption is null and void. So that's why John Hazen phrased it the way he did, and actually I don't think he liked what I did with it. So we also grow tomatoes because those are a crop that are very important to our customers. And then I planted peaches in that greenhouse, which, well, you know, if you're from Georgia, it's not exciting to have a peach, but I had never grown a peach, and now we've had 3 excellent and 1 short crop of peaches, and I understand peaches are cyclical. I was very disappointed, and I do a lot of hand pollinating because I worry about whether the bumblebees are there, so I get out with a little twig and a brush, and I try to wiggle my torso the way a bumblebee would. And this year I had so many bumblebees, I didn't do that, and I had literally, instead of a huge bumper crop from these 8 trees that looked like that, I had 14 peaches this year. So I think I better go back to my old thing. I'm sorry. All right, this slideshow is directed at poultry people, where I've been doing a lot of workshops about whether you can actually do this, not buy grain, because you know we have 300 million hens in cages in the United States, and they eat grain, and I'm very convinced on the arithmetic that squandered resources could feed 300 million birds that are not in cages. And in a grain-short world, that's very important news. Chickens, what they like to do, you know, the woods, hang out, dust bathe. This is just, again, the question comes up, why we keep these animals. And I think that forward-looking animal power is a very important part of the future of farming in Vermont. Jerusalem artichokes, a crop we grow 4 varieties of, very important chicken habitat, very important utilizer. As we develop whole farm systems to manage the resource, we need plants that can grow on the filter. We want to clean up the phosphorus in the lake. We want to stop it before it gets there. And Jerusalem artichokes, a native plant, we have 4 cultivars, underutilized, fantastic phosphorus extractor to grow in the carbon filters we need to put in all the cracks where phosphorus runs into the lake. A lot of our compost making was for me informed by my understanding of how sherries were made. And this is, he's called the Nose. Domek is his name, and he could apparently tell you which sherry came from where. It is a brown-nosed job. Somebody's got to do it. All of the biota that are at work in compost leave odor signatures. One of our most important tools for deciding when compost is mature and ready is to sniff it. And I don't have to know the names of everybody. I just have to have the training. And so some people can smell it, some can't. I've trained a lot of people around this. This is how we export. A lot of it goes out in bulk. Why do we sell compost products, potting soils in Iowa and Wisconsin? It certainly irritates the people in Iowa and Wisconsin who would like to have those customers. People don't really quite necessarily understand, but Vermont Compost is a high-tech export business. Now, 75% of our revenue is coming from growers in other states, mostly neighboring states. And they're all surrounded not only with local products that would like to have that revenue, but with people saying, hey, what are you doing out here in Iowa? We should be using Iowa composts for this. And so the answer is that we provide reliable performance to growers. And really, we always expected to get knocked out of the box in the Midwest. But our business is growing in the Midwest. I still expect not to be able to export compost to the Midwest. It doesn't make any sense. And every region should have competent potting soil. But alas, it's not that way. And so looking forward, in the 40-year frame of our business, which I get to do now, is that I'm certainly not going to be there, and thinking about what our business might become, we expect that there will be competence in all these regions. This is a recent helicopter drone. We now have a helicopter drone, and it gives us, we can get kind of frequent information about what's happening on the farm. So this is what it's looking like lately. And I must be out of time, so I won't leave it at that.
And please hold on to your questions for Karl. I have an opportunity to ask all the panelists questions at the end. Our next speaker is Teresa Snow. Teresa is the Executive Director of Salvation Farms, whose mission is to build increased resilience in Vermont's food system through agriculture surplus management. And Teresa's been doing it in very inventive and dynamic ways, like our other panelists. See here, she's worked in Vermont's agriculture and horticultural sector for 15 years with Pete's Greens, High Mowing Organic Seeds, and the Vermont Food Bank, and she has a degree in sustainable agriculture and natural resource management from Sterling College. Teresa.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Thanks for warming up the crowd. Salvation Farms doesn't really work in a waste reduction. We do deal in reducing food loss. We are dealing with wasted food, but wasted food is often not a lost resource because it tends to either feed animals or it feeds soil. But we work that if it's still an edible food resource, we try to capture it and get it to people. So we're not actually diverting food from the waste stream. So we're a little unique in our work as far as addressing waste. So this carrot or these carrots wouldn't make it to market necessarily. This food wouldn't make it to market. And neither would this. So this is a bin of food that was at a farm off of their wash pack house, and it was going to feed the chickens. And this was a bin full of food at a farm that had set it aside for a local organization who was going to come and pick up this food, sort through it, pack it, and then distribute it to sites that feed vulnerable populations. So this isn't unique. But why is this important? In Vermont alone, we have 48,000 food insecure individuals. Those are people that struggle to meet their food needs on a semi-regular basis. I recently presented to a room of about 300, and so I tried to put into perspective, what is 84,000? If you took a room of 3,000 people and multiplied it by, 300 people and multiplied it by 280, that's for 84,000. So it's a considerable volume of people. It's 14% of our state's population. And we serve 19 million institutional meals every year in our state. Institutional meals like hospitals, nursing homes, schools, prisons, senior meal sites, preschools. Now I tried to figure out too, like 19 million meals is a lot. And if I ate 3 meals a day, how many days would I need to eat 3 meals a day to be 19 million meals? So it's over 300,000. So okay, well, that's 300,000 days. How many years is that? It's over 900. So it would take me 10 lifetimes to eat as many institutional meals as we serve in 1 year. Most of the sites that serve both these institutions and these food insecure individuals are dependent on very cheap food sources, also USDA commodity foods. Okay. So I'll transition a little bit back to food waste. So as Jean had said, Jaime had said that we waste around 40% of our food supply annually in America. Between 40 and 50%. And that's the entire food system. So that's from farms to wholesalers, or distributors to wholesalers to retailers to prepared food sites like restaurants and food service agencies to your retail outlets and your own homes. The leaks represent the average production on a farm, and globally it's estimated that the average farm leaves 1/3 of their production in the field. So that leak would go to market, that leak would go to market, and this one would never leave the farm. So there's a lot of food out there that could feed people, quote unquote, in need. So we really don't have a production issue, we have a distribution issue. What we might have on the production end is maybe we're not producing enough of the right type of foods. So we could shift what we're producing, but pretty much we produce enough food. It's just a priority issue of how we get it to people that need it. So why is there surplus on farms? Farmers always want to fill their market niches. So they're always going to produce enough to buffer environmental and economic elements. So you never know what pests you're going to get hit with or what weather you're going to get hit with, and you never want to say no to a market. So you're going to try to produce enough to buffer for that. And then the other reason there's surplus is often it's cheaper to bring in food from far away. It's just the way it is with our industrial food system. An example of producing, like cyclical producing or successional producing on farms, this is a picture from Pete's Greens in Craftsbury. He grows a fine salad mix, and he will cut a bed of greens just once. So if you get a bag of Pete's Greens, you really shouldn't find a leaf that is cut in half. He doesn't want that out there in the market. So that means that often beds are cut and they're allowed to grow back again, which means there's a lot of food cut and come again. You could cut a bed of greens up to 3 or 4 times before rot becomes an issue. Often beds are completely skipped over because they may have been hit by flea beetles or hail, or there may just be another planting that's of a better quality and a different size, the right size. This is the same for other successional plantings like broccoli and string beans, summer squash and cucumbers, so things that need to be picked on a very regular basis. There's often surplus when you move out of one planting it into the next, because it's a quicker, higher yield, more economical harvest. So they tend to leave the previous planting behind. This is very unique to Vermont. Well, I think it's very unique to Vermont because most seed companies are consolidated. We have a seed company here in Vermont, Jaime Renner Organic Seeds, and they produce about 30% of the seed that they sell, and most of that is wet seed. Wet seed is contained within fruit, so you've got summer squash, winter squash, cucumbers, tomatoes. We have too wet and short of a season to do dry seeds, so dry seeds are most of the things that are contained within flowers. This is a field where they were hybridizing winter squash. Hopefully you all can still hear me. You can see that there's fruit still in these rows. These rows are missing fruit. So the pollen from these plants was needed, and not the seed. Just the seed from this plant was needed. So all of that is edible food that this farm-based company doesn't sell. So that's a perfect opportunity to capture a food product that would otherwise go to waste. And we work pretty closely with Jaime. So how can Vermont keep good food from going to waste or being lost as a food resource? and build food independence. Well, Salvation Farm started in 2004, based in the concept of gleaning. And gleaning is the act of reaping after the harvest. It's an ancient agrarian, and it's referenced in the Bible. It's an act that typically was done by the poor. Farmers would allow the poor traveler to come and take what they didn't remove for their own markets. In modern day, it's really something that the community tends to organize, or the farm tends to organize to benefit other members of the community. So Salvation Farm started gleaning at Pete's Greens, and we've gleaned with more than 100 different farms in the state of Vermont. We've worked with multiple organizations and captured more than 1 million pounds of fruits and vegetables over the past 10 to 12 years. We believe on an annual basis there's about 2 million pounds of fruits and vegetables that go to waste in the state, and that's a really modest estimate. I think that represents about 2% of our marketed production. So there's a considerable amount of food currently going to waste on Vermont farms. One of the organizations that we work with, we created a model that we feel is the most professional, efficient, and effective for community-based gleaning in the state of Vermont. So we've been providing technical assistance to organizations around the state for about 8 to 10 years now since we started. We work in Rutland, and we do everything from helping the Rutland Area Farm and Food Link identify volunteers, approach their farmers, how best to serve their farmers, look at the assets of who they want to serve as recipient sites, and a paid coordinator will on a weekly basis go to farms and pull out of their wash pack houses from farmers market as well as from the field with volunteers. They'll store them at Thomas Dairy, and another volunteer will come and deliver it on a weekly basis to sites that they have a prearranged relationship with. And this is happening in about 7 this is happening in 8 different locations in the state. And Salvation Farm still does some gleaning on our own, but typically we provide a lot of technical assistance to organizations around the state so they can be efficient and effective at serving their communities. Salvation Farms has 2 programs, the Vermont Gleaning Collective, so working with those organizations that are regionally based, and the Vermont Commodity Program. If these boots on the ground gleaning groups are actually capturing the amount of surplus that we produce in the state of Vermont, they're going to be force feeding their communities, and they're going to be gleaning in vain because most of that food will be going to waste. So the Vermont Commodity Program is in concept and in theory is the aggregation, cleaning, packing, and processing so that we can serve those larger institutional meal sites. And we went to a relatively unique partner. We approached the Vermont Department of Corrections. And this is the Southeast State Correctional Facility in Windsor, Vermont. For some reason, they let us in. And they've given us access to this building. This is actually, Windsor was had the first federal penitentiary in the nation, and this property, which is actually a 900-acre state property, was an inmate-operated farm. In the 70s, they actually moved the inmates from the center of town up into this facility and fenced it off. They do have some gardens and some greenhouses, so it has great potential for being agricultural work as well as work and learning, skill-based site. And we thought if we're actually going to be able to respond to the needs of the surplus food we have, we need to be able to take it to a place where we have available and affordable labor, but do it in a way that offers these individuals a dignified work opportunity. I myself oversee inmates in this workspace, and it's really quite empowering for both sides of the relationship. I've worked with about almost 40 different men, about 45 different men, and we've processed 155,000 pounds of surplus donated foods, primarily potatoes, apples, winter squash, corn, sorry, not corn, rutabaga. Okay. So what we do is we bring in large volumes of product. We break it down into smaller containers. We run it through this pack line, the dry brusher, the inspection table, the bagger, guys bag into 10-pound bags. It's a different line when we don't, when we're not doing potatoes. Sew up the bags, we build a pallet, and then we ship that out with another partner, the Black River Produce. So a lot of what Salvation Farms is trying to do is design a surplus management system that's dependent on partners and already existing assets and resources in our for-profit food system. Everything that we need really to manage farm surplus exists in the state. We're also looking at minimally processing, so things that can't go into packages raw. This is not being done at the prison, but ideally we could scale up Vermont Commodities to be a correctional industry, where they would also help us minimally process. So taking compromised product and doing something to it. This we're steaming, running it through a pulver which separates seed and skin from the puree. We cool the puree, put it in bags. Bagged puree squashes looks really gross, the same as applesauce in bags doesn't look real great either. We've done lots of products like this. These peppers, because we didn't have the capacity or infrastructure, we probably got to a quarter of these, just slicing and dicing by hand and putting into bags. So, knowing that I would be here at the Vermont Law School, I wanted to also address some of the unknowns of this. An in-state commodity system, a surplus management system, does not exist in any other state. And it barely exists here in Vermont. I think that we have a great foundation and blueprint. We need a lot of buy-in. We need the state to make a value statement that we don't waste food in Vermont, and we do leverage our resources to capture this food, to feed our vulnerable, and stop spending money on cheap food from far away that doesn't do good for our environment. But we have some big questions. How do farmers get compensated for this? And if they get compensated, is there liability then associated with it? Because right now, a donated food product, there's no liability. We don't have liability, the farmers don't have liability, it falls on the end user. That was legislation that was created to support food banking. So if we take peppers and we slice them and we freeze them and we distribute them to schools, but we want to cover our overhead, so we charge them for the service of cleaning, packing, and shipping. Are we then liable? So we have a lot of questions about how do we compensate farmers, how do we make this a just system for them, as well as a just system for the individuals involved, as well as a dignified food option for those that are receiving it. We also think about not food liability so much, but that I already mentioned, but liability for volunteers that go to farms and work to capture this food to keep it from being a lost food resource. So just to kind of mention those pieces, that if we really want to do this well and make this part of our food system, we've got to overcome those obstacles. Opportunities, I suppose. So, and contact information. So, thanks.
Thanks, Teresa. So I'd like to open the floor for questions. Go ahead. Is there a microphone back? Yep.
Thank you. I have a question for Jean, and maybe Teresa might want to comment on this as well. You talked about composting roadkill and other mortality, and it seems that there's nutrient-rich food that could go to you, that could be eaten by humans, and I'm wondering if you had any thoughts as to how that might be managed.
Most of the animals that we're dealing with that we have to dispose of shouldn't be eaten. We would question whether they should be eaten. So roadkill is different in every state. If you hit an animal, sometimes you're allowed to take it, sometimes you're not, sometimes you get into trouble. We do have a venison donation program, but most roadkill does not go to venison donation. As far as livestock, it's usually, there's reasons why it can't be eaten.
Okay.
Yeah, and there are organizations nationally that are like Farmers and Hunters for the Hungry. They tend not to use roadkill. I do know that in the state of Vermont, though, if you call the warden when you do hit an animal, often you're able to take the animal home if that's something you want to do. We are looking at a meat, gosh, so odd to say meat rescue program, but like a dairy beef program as part of the Vermont Commodity Program. I think it's over 19,000 cows are leaving the state. Between 19 and 30,000 cows annually are leaving the state to be processed at a facility in Pennsylvania. And again, that's a valuable lost food resource. If we could retain some of the higher quality beef, we could certainly use that to feed some of our population.
Thanks. Any other questions? There was another hand up earlier. I saw it, but... Oh, in the back.
So this is a question mostly, I guess, for Jean. I think you talked a lot about some of the initiatives in New York and Connecticut and other surrounding states, understanding, obviously, as well as Vermont, that there's a lot of sort of local grassroots buy-in likely for these types of programs. And I think that I travel a decent bit around the country, and my sense would be that generally you don't see the same types of buy-in for these initiatives in other places. So how do you get that kind of buy-in in other places that may not have the same willingness to move towards things like composting?
Sure. In the Northeast, Northwest California, composting is being adopted very broadly. And there's a lot of good systems in the middle. I think you're still going to be able to sell compost to Illinois for a long time because they're composting some stuff, usually leaf and yard waste. If there's an emergency, molasses spills, they might mop it up with something and compost it, stuff like that. But there's not as much composting happening in the middle. Or even in like Florida, there's a certain amount, but it's not as progressive, I should say. So we've adopted earlier. I think the way to get that happening is actually to provide more education for people so that they know that they have the opportunity to be able to compost. Sometimes they don't know. We have quite a few composters in Kansas, which is maybe an unlikely place. It's in the middle of the United States. And they've found that there's quite a bit of value. They can make more money. We have a farmer that digests their manure, and he said, when the milk prices go down, compost looks pretty darn good. It's that balance in a business, because everybody produces organic waste, and if it's just being shipped to a landfill or something like that, it's not helping anything. And honestly, our Midwest needs organic matter more than any other part of the country. We're creating another Dust Bowl. Yeah.
Karl or Teresa, do you want to answer the same question? Just in terms of getting buy-in to these initiatives.
Well, I mean, one thing in Vermont, where we're even in a place where we have pretty good buy-in conceptually, and everybody agrees we ought to be doing this, one of our challenges is that composting is a very tough business. The economics of it are very challenging. And even lately, while on the one hand we've had Act 148, we're mandating compost making. Several of the compost making businesses in Vermont have stopped accepting food, either gone out of business or had to retrench. I would have to say that now 20 some odd years in this business, we've had several waves in my business of existential challenge where it looked like we weren't going to be able to keep moving. And frankly, in our case, a lot of that was, what's a charitable way to say this, regulatory confusion. The one hand not knowing what the other hand was doing in various portions of governance. And go composting, you find out there are a lot of governments out there, various levels of government that can suddenly show up with questions about what you're doing that are very hard to answer. Is it agriculture? Well, I would have to say, yes, I think so, but that isn't how we ended up deciding. We ended up involved in a many-year process that included a bunch of legislation that ended up requiring an Act 250 permit. It would be nice if we could streamline our efforts. We have things like farm to plate, and we're really getting a lot of PR about the Vermont brand and all this stuff, but on the ground, again, this is a tough business, and until and unless it's, let me put it this way, there's no smart money coming into making compost in Vermont, so now you're down to dumb and dreaming money, or pig-headed money, and it's a problem, and I don't have the answer for you right now about it. We have some models. My business actually is profitable, but if you take my price list and your calculator and go to bed dreaming about starting a project, you might be disappointed.
I think buying is actually quite hard to get when you're creating a new system, new programs, and when you are dependent on partners. I do think regulatory bodies or Salvation Farms is destined to come across many of them. We are nonprofit, but already to work in the prison, they wanted us to get a $5 million insurance policy, and now our insurance company's like, we're not even quite sure we want to cover you. So, let alone just the implications of challenging a USDA commodity system with an in-state independent system, and trying to see this really in the state infrastructure and value system. So, certainly, I sense challenges ahead.
We have a minute left. Are there any other questions?
I just have a quick question for Karl. I was very intrigued by your presentation, and especially the idea of having to somehow compost ice cream waste. How do you develop your methods? Is this just trial and error? I mean, it sort of makes me think of the Polyface farm, where over generations they sort of developed ways to keep the whole process on the farm. And I'm wondering if you've gone through that same process. Is there a group of people out there that does this? Is there anybody in academia that supports the development of these methods? Or are you just out there with buckets of ice cream and dumping stuff in and seeing what happens?
Well, when we started doing ice cream, we were out there with buckets of ice cream. You develop some practical ideas. A liquid can move very fast. So, if you start chasing 2 million gallons of ice cream with a loader, it'll outrun you. So we have these ideas, never a liquid again. We try to make it into pudding at least. You can chase a pudding. These are practical ideas about, I grew up on farms where manure was very respected as a limiting resource about how much farming you could do. It's only very recently that we've contrived to turn, in industrial agriculture, manure into a liability, a pollution. And some of that transition is useful to think about, I can remember in the middle 1960s, maybe 63 or 4, having the visiting ag extension agent from the university saying, you can't afford to spread your manure. You should bulldoze it into the brook and buy 10-10-10. Okay, where did he come up with this interesting idea? And literally, bulldoze it into the brook is what he was talking about on the farm that I'm talking about. But, the 10-10-10 people had been funding university research at that point for a while. And we look at the NPK value of manure and what it costs to spread it and what fertilizers cost. And bulldoze it in the brook could, by that very reductionist and oversimplifying arithmetic, make some sense. But, and over time, manure, management was in many Vermont farms, as you added more cows and added distant cornfields. And now that economic is turning, fertilizer is expensive. But one of the big challenges for getting the ice cream sopped up is that composters compete for carbon ultimately against burning it. Every day we compete. Wood chips get burned for electricity. Electricity is a lot sexier than food because the internet runs on it. And so, Yeah, bulking, we didn't talk about, but making those liquid fractions, many of the most valuable and high nutrient and most pollution potential materials are too loose to compost there, and they need to have carbonaceous material added to them so that you can get air through them and manage them. Didn't exactly answer your question about whether there are all kinds of groups trying things. I have to say, we've been feeding birds without buying them any grain since 1998. We know that we can produce, the national flock produces at a rate called a 72% layout. That means if you have 100 birds, they lay 72 eggs a day. We can exceed that layout on these rations. I've been doing this since 98 and talking about it a lot. We're still the largest poultry egg operation that I know about doing this process without grain. Why is it taking so long? I don't know the answer to that question.
All right, well, I just want to end by thanking each of you, Gene, Karl, and Teresa. It's been really interesting and very entertaining, and deeply appreciate your time. My understanding is we have a brief break before closing remarks. Is that right, Jack?
No, we're going to close right now.
Perfect.
Stay seated. Okay.
Can I add a really brief share? current regulatory challenges. And I'm going to try to say it really fast. I don't know how many of you people have followed the sales taxing of compost and potting soils in Vermont. In 2007 to 2009, the sales tax department decided, without telling anybody, that that compost was not animal bedding and that it was sales taxable. Okay, fertilizer is exempt for working farm. Production farmer buys 10, 10, 10, files an exemption, doesn't pay sales tax. They have denied all of the exemption forms that farmers file and are saying that sales tax is due. Now, we went into legislative process, and over a couple of years, we got half a loaf. We got that going forward from July 1st of 2014, compost and potting soil are non-taxable in Vermont to farmers and even to homeowners if they buy it in bulk, more than a yard at a time. The tax department has taken this legislation. We didn't get retroactivity. And we went into this legislative thing with a $118,000 invoice from the tax department for taxes that we did not collect from farmers in 2009, 10, and 11. The tax department has interpreted the change of the clarification, as we understood it by the legislature, to mean and affirm that the tax is due for the 5.5 years going back to 2009. And they've come ahead and said, all right, taxes, penalties, and interest, which now amounts to almost $200,000 for us, which is an existential thing for our business. We have 12 employees, gross just shy of $2 million a year, $200,000 that we don't have, that we didn't collect. It's not like money we took and didn't pay tax on. This is money we didn't collect. Anyway, we're in a legal challenge to their assertion that compost is not fertilizer under the rule, because fertilizer was exempt. The thing about a legal challenge to the tax department is that my lawyer's clock runs $220 an hour. I also get to help we all pay the lawyers on the other side. So we could definitely lose by winning, where so I just put that out there, that this is a current event. We don't know where it's really going to go. And we have a legal theory that we're interested in pursuing.
Thanks for sharing. Where's Jack?
So we will actually wrap up right now, and thank you to this panel for closing it out. It's been really a wonderful day. I wanted to thank specifically the following people: Jonathan Maria, Rebecca Purdom, and Melissa Scanlon for advising the journal and helping us put this thing together. Ann Linehan in the business office for getting all of our emails and processing all of our receipts and everything. Martina Rutowski, Chef Jeff, and Fitzbo did the lunch, and we'll be doing the wine and cheese afterwards, which is at 5:30 back in Yates. Bill Bond, Corey Hyrick, and the IT office, they've been fantastic. This stage was literally built within the last week, and Bill and Corey rigged it up and got it all together. This is the first event that's on it, so they did a great job. And they were working late into last night getting that together for us. We really appreciate it. Andrew Brackett, Lori Campbell, and Buildings and Grounds have been very helpful. I'll say that the next thing in the program, the last thing in the program, I know it's getting late and light is fading. We have Andrew over there and Jeff over there. Andrew's going to lead, if anyone's interested, a tour to go see both the solar panels on campus and just sort of discuss what those power and where that energy goes. And Jeff is going to lead people, hopefully you've used the composting toilets here on campus. He'll take you downstairs to see the unit that processes that and talk about where that goes and what happens with that. So if you can meet with them when Megan and I are done speaking here, they'll take you around. We also wanted to thank Mary Ellen Applequist for doing all of the PR and helping with the poster, Kathy McCullough for reserving the rooms. The artist who did the poster, his name is Alex Pentecost Farron. It's 3 names and it's strange spelling, so if you want to look her up, I'd be happy to give you the spelling. And the artist who did the photographs in Oaks Hallway is Greg Segal. You can find him online. Greg has 2 G's. I was trying to find how to capture the event, trying to find a way to summarize it, and I figured I would just use some of the words from the speakers themselves said today. So starting at the beginning, Lauren Valley was speaking of urine and saying it's not really waste, we've just termed it that. We're choosing to call these things this and choosing to, in the way that we're designating them, ignore them or push them away or get them out of our lives. Scudder Parker said waste is not a product, it's a decision. Sarah Westerveld said, away is our ecosystem. We only have one. This stuff isn't going anywhere else. There's no other else. It's right here, even if we can't see it. Kathy Jameson said, change the perspective from waste to materials. These are things we can reclaim and reuse and own. We can make sense of these things. And of course, Karl Hammer said to me over the phone months ago and repeated it today, waste is a verb, not a noun. We intentionally, or at the very least recklessly, make a lot of, I'll call them mistakes, make a lot of waste in our lifetime. And I hope that in seeing the different panels today, you can be more conscious of your impact in that and how your work can help to reduce it in other avenues as well. Those are my closing comments. I think Megan's going to share something.
I couldn't come up with any closing comments, so I just took a page from our professor and a suggestion from our friends, and I thought that we would just read a poem. And I hope you all know it. Sarah Cynthia Sylvia Stout would not take the garbage out. She'd scour the pots and scrape the pans, candy the yams and spice the hams, and though her daddy would scream and shout, she simply would not take the garbage out. And so it piled up to the ceilings, coffee grounds, potato peelings, brown bananas, rotten peas, chunks of sour cottage cheese. It filled the can, it covered the floor, it cracked the window and blocked the door, with bacon rinds and chicken bones, drippy ends of ice cream cones, prune pits, peach pits, orange peel, gloppy lumps of cold oatmeal, pizza crusts and withered greens, soggy beans and tangerines, crusts of blackburn buttered toast, gristly bits of beefy roast. The garbage rolled down onto the hall, it raised the roof, it broke the wall. Greasy napkins, cookie crumbs, globs of gooey bubble gum, cellophane from green bologna, rubbery blubbery macaroni, peanut butter caked and dry, curdled milk and crusts of pie, moldy melons, dried up mustard, eggshells mixed with lemon custard, cold french fries and rancid meat, yellow lumps of cream of wheat. At last the garbage reached so high, finally, that it touched the sky, and all the neighbors moved away, and none of her friends would come to play. And finally, Sarah Cynthia Sylvia Stout said, okay, I'll take the garbage out. But then, of course, it was too late. The garbage reached across the state, from New York to the Golden Gate. And there, in the garbage-sheeted hate, poor Sarah met an awful fate that I cannot now relate, because the hour is much too late. But children, remember Sarah Stout, and always take the garbage, let's say, for composting.